In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Please be seated. Today we remember the feast of the Confession of St. Peter. Our church is Trinity+St. Peter's, and St. Peter is our patron saint. So it's fitting for us to remember his feast day. But it seems a little odd, doesn't it, that it's called the Confession of St. Peter? Why would it be called that? What did Peter need to confess? Well, there are a couple of meanings to the word confession. The first one is to admit guilt, but there's another meaning, which is to profess a religious faith. So when we make a confession that we are Christians, we are admitting and identifying ourselves as Christians. And today we remember Peter's confession that Jesus is the Messiah, and this is the passage that we read this morning from Matthew. So why do we celebrate this feast of the Confession of St. Peter? Well, without St. Peter, it would be difficult to imagine a church at all. St. Peter is a real-life person who made our faith possible. That's why we celebrate him today, and specifically his faith. Our faith exists because his faith preceded us. Here's a man, a very ordinary man, who was able to look at Jesus in person. We don't have that luxury, do we? We can't look at Jesus in person. He no longer walks the earth. And so we are asked to take Peter's word and the word of those others who were alive during Jesus' time, that Jesus was and is the Messiah. And so it's worth considering just who was Peter anyway. As we learn in this passage, Peter's original name was Simon or Shimon, like the Israeli politician Shimon Peres. And Jesus changes his name to Peter from the Greek word Petros or rock. Peter's calling is to be the solid foundation on which the entire Christian church is to be founded. Really? Ironic, isn't it? Isn't this the same guy who denied Jesus 3 times? Isn't this the man who could not bear the thought of Jesus' confrontation with the authorities in Jerusalem? The man who thought it was more important for Jesus to be safe rather than to expose himself to danger? A man whom Jesus found to be an obstacle as much as a help to his mission, to whom he commanded, "Get behind me, Satan." Have you ever worked with anybody like that? They're a help, but they can also be an obstacle. Clearly, it is not Peter himself who becomes the rock, but God working through Peter. And not through Peter's courage or wisdom, but through his faith. And the fact is that God has a history of choosing to work through people who are not the best and brightest. And Peter does seem to fall into that category from the glimpses we get of his personality in the Gospels. He was a fisherman in Bethsaida along with his brother Andrew and the sons of Zebedee, James and John. And you will recall at the Last Supper, Jesus bends down to wash Peter's feet, and Peter hotly refuses. "I'm just a guy. You can't wash my feet." And Jesus responds, "If I don't wash your feet, then you'll have no share with me." "Oh, in that case, wash my hands and my head as well." Peter is often depicted as a bit impulsive, a bit of a clown. And then he has a dark side as well. He's violent. We see him cut off the ear of the guard who comes to arrest Jesus, and Jesus kind of has to put it back on again. Above all, Peter is very human. And because of that, he is very relatable. We're able to relate to Peter. He's not a perfect person. And yet God is able to use Peter in all of his lack of sophistication and human weakness. And in doing so, we learn a very important lesson about God. God uses sinners to accomplish great things. And this should come as a piece of very welcome news in the light of our new president. It really is true. Before Peter, there was David, King David. What do you know about him? He was one of the greatest figures of the Hebrew Bible. He's the exemplar of religio-ethnic pride for all the Jews. Do you also know that David was an adulterer? That he wanted a woman, he saw this beautiful woman, Bathsheba, actually taking a bath at the time, too, which is confusing since her name is Bathsheba. Or appropriate. That's why it's easy to remember this story. It's all about the bath. So David spies her out of his window taking a bath, and he says, I want that one. And so he brings her to him and then brings her husband, Ebenezer, I think that's his name, maybe not, to him. And he sends her husband off to the front lines to meet a certain death in order to possess this woman. This is the hero of the Old Testament, David. He's one of the worst womanizers of the entire history of humankind. Perhaps there is hope for our new president after all. Somehow, despite human weakness, God is able to use people. Maybe because of their weakness, because of their flaws. And we really see that in Peter. In the final chapter of John's Gospel, in one of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances, he appears to Peter, and Peter affirms his love for Jesus 3 times. What was that about? Well, he is undoing the threefold denial. God actively works with Peter towards his redemption by offering him an opportunity to make amends for his sin. And God works with us in the very same way. And each of us is given opportunities to make amends, and it's up to each of us to choose to do so. Now, there are many legends about Peter. And these legends that he lived in Rome, for example. There's very little historical evidence to support that, and zero biblical evidence to support that Peter ever lived in Rome. We know that he lived in Antioch, that he was probably a patriarch in Antioch. And yet Peter becomes the first pope in the Roman Catholic tradition, Il Papa. And he is this huge towering figure of the Christian faith. This simple fisherman who resisted Jesus' mission, who stood in his way, becomes one of the most significant figures in the formation of a church that has had more human adherents than any other church in human history. So what does that tell us about the possibilities for ourselves, for you and me, or for our leaders, some of whom seem hopelessly flawed? In my conversation with one of you yesterday, who will remain nameless, but who is the junior warden, we recalled that our retiring president, is unquestionably a good man, and our new president, unquestionably less so. And yet, it is regrettable that so little seems to have really been accomplished during the last 8 years, certainly in terms of the widening gap between the rich and the poor. So could it be that God will be able to do more during the term of a man who seems less admirable as a person? Anything is possible with God, as we know from the story of Peter. God works through everyone, despite themselves sometimes. God gives everyone an opportunity to make amends. And God can work through you and me when we choose to follow Jesus. Amen.